So June is the month of the Sacred Heart. We know that. This devotion is offered or accessible to everyone, but in a particular way, it seems appropriate for those who are ministerial priests. We see this on the one hand from the quote of St. John Vianney, a quote we find in the Catechism. The priesthood is the love of the heart of Jesus. The phrase suggests that somehow the ministerial priesthood is an extension or an outreach of Christ's love for his people. And on the other hand, too, it calls our attention that many saintly priests have had a particular devotion to the Sacred Heart. It suggests that the Sacred Heart is perhaps a model or an exemplar for the priesthood. For instance, Pope St. John Paul II called the Litany of the Sacred Heart his favorite prayer. And one of his longest series of Wednesday audiences, which went from June 1985 through November 1989, with a handful of interruptions, was dedicated to examining each of the invocations in that litany. Likewise, Pope St. John XXIII offers numerous and powerful examples and reflections on the Sacred Heart. Even as a seminarian, I must annihilate myself in the Sacred Heart. I must think of myself as living solely for the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And I want the devotion to the Sacred Heart to be the measure of all my spiritual progress. We'll return to these phrases later. So if the ministerial priesthood can be considered as a participation in Christ's priesthood, as we heard some mention of already, and as will be mentioned in the talk of Father Marcelo Navarro and Sister Magdalene tomorrow, so I wash my hands. If we consider the priesthood, the ministerial priesthood, as a participation in the Sacred Heart, well, it should prove as a useful adjunct or a complement to those considerations. So in the exposition that follows, we're just going to see 3 points. First, theological considerations of the priesthood in Aquinas. Second, theological foundations for the devotion to the Sacred Heart. And third, the notion of participation as applied to the priesthood and the Sacred Heart. So Aquinas, Sacred Heart, participation. So there are 3 aspects of Aquinas' explanation and understanding of the ministerial priesthood that are of special importance for our study. First, that the priest is a mediator. Second, that the priest is a minister. And third, that the priest is ordained especially for celebrating the Eucharist. So mediator, minister, and the Eucharist. First, Aquinas firmly maintains that the priest is a mediator between God and men. You can find this affirmation throughout the Thomistic corpus. One example would be the Summa Theologica, Prima Secunda, question 102, article 4, ad 6, where we read, the priest is the mediator between God and the people, governing the people by divine power. Or in the commentary of the letter to the Hebrews, it should be noted that a priest is a mediator between God and the people, and every priest is a mediator. To this, however, we need to add 2 important qualifications. First, even if every priest is a mediator, that mediation is derived or participated. The one mediator is Jesus Christ. This is simply biblical. The first letter to Timothy. There is one mediator between God and the human race, Jesus Christ, himself human. But what's interesting is the explanation that Aquinas gives of this, in a particular way in the commentary on the sentences. Commenting on the 3rd book, Distinction 19, Aquinas notes that a mediator acts as a middle, because in some way he is. He's a middle between 2 extremes. This could either be because the middle partakes of either extreme, in his Latin, medium participat utrumque extremorum, or because it is under the first and above the last. And so Aquinas says the following. He says that Christ is a mediator particularly and precisely in his human nature, since, quote, by making satisfaction for men in virtue of his human nature, he joined men to God. And he also partook of each of the extremes inasmuch as he is a man, beatitude from God, but weakness from men. And also as a man, he was both above men through the fullness of graces in the union, and beneath God on account of his assuming a created nature. And therefore, properly speaking, by reason of his human nature, he is a mediator. Moreover, he can be called a mediator by reason of his being a composite person with respect to the 2 of the stated conditions, insofar as he joined men to God, and insofar as he fully shares in the nature of each extreme, not merely by participation. So again, the salient point here is that Christ is a mediator because his human nature, right, which joins in the union of a single person, in the union of a single person, it unites the two extremes of the mediation. As Aquinas points out, properly speaking, this isn't participation, since Christ is both fully divine and fully human. Now, if Christ is the only mediator, then how are all the other priests to be considered mediators? This leads to our second qualification, that the priest as mediator is intimately linked with the priest as minister. We see Aquinas make this connection explicitly in several texts, right? For instance, in Liber de Perfectione Spiritualis Vitae, we see that the bishop is bound by office to dispense spiritual gifts, and thus he becomes a mediator between God and man, acting in the place of him, vicem eius agens, who is the one mediator of God and man, Jesus Christ. But this notion of vicarious action is seen also in Summa, in the Tertia Pars, question 26, article 1. When addressing the question of whether it's proper for Christ to be the mediator between God and man, Aquinas assures us, yes, that it is most proper, since Christ reconciled God to man. Indeed, Christ alone is the perfect mediator of God and men, inasmuch as by his death, he reconciled the human race to God. Yet Thomas adds a clarification at the end of the corpus. He says, however, nothing hinders certain others from being called mediators, in some respect, between God and men, for as much as they cooperate in uniting men to God, dispositively or ministerially. The response to the first objection makes it clear that those who give dispositive cooperation were the prophets of old, whereas, quote, the priests of the new law may be considered mediators of God and men, inasmuch as they are ministers of the true mediator by administering in his stead the saving sacraments to men. So priests are mediators because they are ministers of Christ, the mediator. This leads to our second consideration, namely that Aquinas insists that the priest is a minister. Again, we find this particularly in the letter to the Hebrews, the commentary on the letter to the Hebrews. Christ alone is the true priest, but others are his ministers. But what's important is Aquinas' very specific understanding of minister. Aquinas asserts that the minister is compared to his master as an instrument to the principal agent. For just as an instrument is moved by the agent in order to produce an effect, so the minister is moved by his master to execute his will. This idea that the minister is an instrument originally comes from Aristotle, as Aquinas often notes. For instance, in his commentary on the fourth book of Sentences, Aquinas argues that a minister is like an instrument of the one for whom he is the minister. Hence, the philosopher says that a slave is like an animate tool, and thus the virtue of the sacrament, as well as the minister and the character, are instrumental. Now, the minister and the sacramental character are instrumental. This is why Aquinas can maintain, as we heard quoted in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 4, Chapter 76, Christ himself accomplishes all the Church's sacraments. It is he who baptizes. It is he who forgives sins. He is the true priest who offered himself on the altar of the cross, and by whose power his own body is consecrated daily on the altar. And yet, because he was not to remain bodily present to all his faithful, he chose ministers, that through them he might give that same body to the faithful, an idea, again, that we will return to later. This divine power that is conferred on priests by means of their ordination is labeled precisely as participation by Aquinas. For instance, returning to the Summa Contra Gentiles 4, chapter 74, we read, Christ ministers needed to share in his divinity, aliqui divinitatis eius participare, by a kind of spiritual power, since the instrument shares, instrumentum aliquid participat, in the power of the principal agent. That participation of spiritual power explains why the priest's moral state, for instance, mortal sin, heresy, etc., doesn't affect the efficacy or the use of that power. The priest, for Aquinas, is merely the instrument. Since the principal agent is God, the divine action is effective even if an excommunicated priest or a priest in mortal sin celebrates the sacraments, as Aquinas makes clear specifically in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 4, 77, when he argues that the sacraments can be dispensed by wicked ministers. The moral state of the priest does affect whether the priest is well disposed or not for dispensing the sacraments, but not their efficacy. However, there is one thing that needs to take place for the priest to make use of that spiritual power. Aquinas notes that, unlike an inanimate instrument, which cannot oppose the action of the principal agent, an inanimate instrument which is not only used but acts in some way, namely acting by a command and not moved by force, intention is required to exercise the ministry to which it is applied. And again, Aquinas applies a very linear logic with this. He says that, and quote, this is from the Super Sententiae, Book 4. He says, I answer that a single effect has a single cause. If a single effect proceeds from several causes, it's necessary that those causes be in some way made one with each other. Now, for a sacrament's effect, we see that many things must concur, namely the minister, the form of the words, and the matter. However, these things cannot be united into one cause except by the intention of the one baptizing, who actually applies the form to the matter, and indeed his own ministry to both. And all this pertains to the conferral of the sacrament. And thus the intention of one baptizing is required. And likewise, in all the other sacraments also, the intention of the minister is required with the due matter and form, not only for bringing about the sacrament's effect, but for receiving the sacrament. So earlier we mentioned, and here we can summarize our conclusions from the first section, the giving of that same body, namely the Eucharist, to the faithful, which leads to our third consideration. Again, Aquinas maintains constantly that the principal work of the priest is the consecration of the Eucharist. We see this, for instance, in question 37 of the Supplementum, where we read in Article 2, the sacrament of order is directed to the sacrament of the Eucharist, which is the sacrament of the sacraments. For the power of order is directed either to the consecration of the Eucharist itself or to some ministry in connection with the sacrament of the Eucharist. Likewise, in Quadrivial 11, question 7, Article 1, Aquinas, following Dionysius, notes, as Dionysius says, there are three actions of the hierarchy. To illumine is proper to priests, and this consists especially in the Eucharist. Hence, to summarize quickly what we've seen, for Aquinas, Christ is the one mediator between God and man, and this on account of his human nature, which unites the two extremes of the mediation. Since Christ is fully divine and fully human, we wouldn't say he participates in humanity or divinity, but rather unites the two extremes in himself. Second, the priest can be called a mediator inasmuch as he participates in the divine power by means of the sacrament of holy orders. That sacrament confers on the priest a spiritual power, which enables him to serve in Christ's place by providing the sacraments. As a minister of Christ, the priest serves as Christ's animate instrument. As an instrument, the priest's own moral state and dispositions do not affect the efficacy of the sacraments. It's sufficient that the priest unites the matter and form of the sacrament through an intention to produce the sacrament. And lastly, the priesthood and the priestly power are conferred on priests is principally for consecrating the Eucharist. So all of this seems rather minimalist, we could say. Ordination confers a spiritual power on the priest, which allows him to serve as an animate instrument of the divine power, and hence as a minister of Christ. Upon the power's valid conferral, it remains indefinitely, so that even if the priest falls into mortal sin, schism, or heresy, all that is needed for the priest to consecrate the Eucharist is valid matter, valid form, and the intention of the celebrant, which provides that link. So to supplement this, let us now turn to a theology of the Sacred Heart. We propose that by drawing parallels to Aquinas' reasoning and by applying the notion of participation, we can consider how the priesthood might be considered as a participation in the Sacred Heart. So now with the theological foundations of devotion to the Sacred Heart, here we won't expound the history of the devotion to the Sacred Heart or devotional writings. Not to diminish those, I mean, they're important, but we're going to focus on magisterial documents and theological works. In particular, the encyclical Aurietis Aquas by Pope Pius XII, that's the 1956 encyclical on devotion to the Sacred Heart, as well as the 1986 book by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Behold the Pierced One, An Approach to a Spiritual Christology. Now, a first notable reference to participation occurs in Aurietis Aquas 75. There, with a specific note that references the Summa Theologiae Tertia Pars, question 19, Article 1, we read, the Sacred Heart of Jesus shares in a most intimate way in the life of the incarnate Word, incarnati verbi vitae particeps, and has been thus assumed as a kind of instrument of the divinity. It is therefore beyond all doubt that in the carrying out of the works of grace and divine omnipotence, his heart, no less than the other members of his human nature, is also a legitimate symbol of that unbounded love. And indeed, in the text that's referred to in the footnote, Aquinas says that the divine nature makes use of the operation of the human nature as of the operation of its instrument. And in the same way, the human nature shares in the operation of the divine nature, as an instrument shares in the operation of the principal agent. So we see an interesting parallel begin to emerge between a consideration of the priesthood in St. Thomas and a Thomistically inspired consideration of the Sacred Heart. The priest is an instrument of Christ, the priest, participating in the priestly power of Christ, who, in his human nature, is the one mediator between God and man. The Sacred Heart, part of Christ's human nature, as it were, is an instrument of the Christ's divinity, which likewise participates in the operations of the divine nature. What becomes more salient, though, is that the Sacred Heart is a kind of maximal instrument. Whereas the ministerial priest is an instrument of the divinity insofar as he participates in the divine power, the Sacred Heart not only participates as an instrument, as it were, but is perfectly united with Christ in act and intention and in love. Christ compares the priest to a slave because both are animate instruments. But just as a slave can fulfill the master's command without sharing in his intentions or loves, the priest can serve as Christ's minister without charity and without virtue. The Sacred Heart, on the contrary, gives an example of maximal agreement in God the Son's intentions and loves. The encyclical makes this apparent and expresses this maximum of love at various points, and often in reference both to the priesthood and the Eucharist. We read this, for instance, in point 69, which says, "But who can worthily depict the beatings of the divine heart, the signs of his infinite love, of the moments when he granted men his greatest gifts, his self in the sacrament of the Eucharist, and the office of the priesthood which he shared with us?" Likewise, recalling what we said earlier regarding the preeminent importance of the Eucharist in Aquinas' theology, at point 71, the encyclical concludes, "It can therefore be declared that the divine Eucharist, both the sacrament which he gives to men and the sacrifice in which he unceasingly offers himself from the rising of the sun to the going down thereof, and likewise the priesthood, are indeed gifts of the Sacred Heart of Jesus." To add yet another element to these considerations, in his The Mystery of Easter, Substance and Foundation of Devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, Joseph Ratzinger proposes that the encyclical Arietes Aquas, quote, develops an anthropology and a theology of bodily existence, which it regards as the philosophical and psychological basis of the cult of the heart of Jesus. As he summarizes, since the heart is the visible form of the person is the image of God, it follows that the body, in its whole context of relationships, is the place where the divine is portrayed, uttered, and rendered accessible to our gaze. It is only the Son's incarnation, argues Ratzinger, that imparts to man and the visible world their ultimate meaning. And this text is very beautiful. He traces all the patrology of the heart, the meaning. And he concludes this text, which was meant for a Congress on the Sacred Heart, by saying, "The view that the heart is the locus of the saving encounter with the Logos has a very firm basis in the new synthesis achieved by patristic thought." And as he says, this synthesis goes beyond mere knowledge. It's a love that we could say surpasses knowledge. So Ratzinger's reflections add another aspect to our consideration of the priesthood. Just as the Sacred Heart is an image of God's love, a body where the divine is portrayed and made accessible to us, we can also say that the priest is, in a particular way, a body where the divine is portrayed. The Sacred Heart extends its love into the world, and the priest is an extension of that love into the world, one who utters the divine and renders the divine accessible to the world's eyes. So then with these foundations, we will consider very briefly the notion of participation applied to the priesthood and the Sacred Heart. Right? We've talked about this way in which the priest shares in the ministry of Christ, and then hopefully also in his intentions and loves of his master. If grace is a participation in the divine life, as Aquinas maintains quite often, and the charity whereby we love our neighbor is a participation in the divine charity, which we read in the Secunda Secondae, then the priest who is not in a state of grace can still be an instrument, but lacks that intimate union with the heart of Christ. Furthermore, this supernatural participation can become assimilation or a tingere, which, in the words of the Italian Thomist Cornelio Fabro, expresses a participation according to a more or less perfect, but always proper degree of assimilation of the lower with respect to the higher. Attingere and participation overlap and mutually extend each other. When treated in this light, then, those phrases of John the 23rd acquire new meaning. I must annihilate myself in the Sacred Heart. The Sacred Heart must be the measure of all my spiritual progress. And to conclude, Pius XII draws Aurietas Aquas to a close by echoing the words of Leo XIII. Behold, today, another true sign of God's favor is presented to our gaze, namely the Sacred Heart of Jesus, shining forth with a wondrous splendor from amidst flames. In it must all our hopes be placed. From it, salvation is to be sought and hoped for. Salvation is to be sought and hoped for from the Sacred Heart, a heart which has gifted the world with both the Eucharist and the priesthood as extensions of his saving will throughout the centuries. Thank you.